So Heyman, you are off to New Haven, Connecticut, home of some, mid-tier law school, but more importantly, some really excellent pizza. What are you most excited about in terms of New Haven pizza? And to be clear, there is only one correct answer, which I will grade you harshly on.
I have a two-tiered answer. The first is that
It's very loyally of you. Already.
I was going to say already ready to go. For
already a law student. It depends, Professor.
Test.
Yeah.
Look, Breyer teaches at Harvard, not at Yale.
I take inspiration from all places, but I promised Tyler that I would try. I believe it's Clam on pizza.
Yes,
is that the correct answer?
That is the correct answer. That is 1,000% the correct answer. I am so glad that Tyler suggested that. We need to give him a raise. That is amazing. Yes, clam pizza.
But clams on pizza?
I know.
Really?
It's so good. It is the best. I mean, it is America's true contribution to pizza. Is the clam pizza.
Whoa.
Yep.
Whoa.
Yep.
That sounds like some coastal elite.
Look, it's not the best pizza. The best pizza is still probably your classic Neapolitan, buffalo mozzarella pizza. Like at the end of the day, but the second best pizza in the entire goddamn world is a clam pizza.
I love clams. I just don't know if I want it on top of a pizza. Some things are best left separate. Really, I'm a pineapple on pizza person, but I don't know if I can get behind the clams. Well, the second tier of my answer is I want to find the best gluten-free pizza because I'm gluten intolerant. And
Sure.
I think that if you want to have the role of best pizza in the US or world or whatever it is, you have to also be able to kill it on the gluten-free pizza. So that will be my first hunt. I
mean, it's 2024. I mean, I'm sure gluten-free pizza technology has developed quite a bit.
Definitely. It has. I want a local slice that's good for gluten though.
So can I just say we've had this whole conversation about pizza and Quinta Dirty Jersey Jurassic has stayed totally silent. I feel like you're gonna.
It's because I'm
have
confident.
Great pizza in Jersey.
I'm confident of the quality of New Jersey pizza. I don't even need to debate this. I just know.
There's not a lot of quality in New Jersey, but the pizza is definitely.
How dare you? First off. But second off, we do have great pizza.
You have great pizza. Hello and welcome to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Alan Rosenstein, here without one of my other regular co-host, Scott Anderson, who is on a well-deserved vacation somewhere, I think in the United States, but who knows. But fortunately, I am here with our third regular co-host, Quinta Jurassic.
Hello.
And we are joined with two wonderful members of the Lawfare Clubhouse, Kevin Frazier, Lawfare's Tarbell Fellow.
Howdy.
And Heyman Han, Lawfare Associate Editor for another day, week, 2 weeks, not very long, sadly.
Less than 24 hours.
Oh God! Oh wow! I didn't realize.
This episode will come out after I've left.
Amazing. So we are really getting you right under the wire as you prepare to go to sunny, clam pizza-filled New Haven to begin your legal studies.
That's right.
Well, it's been a great ride, and we are so excited to have you. And talk to you for at least one more Rational Security episode. And what we're calling in your honor, the Gluten-Free Clam Pizza is the best pizza edition.
Thank you, Alan.
You're never going to go back. Once you taste clam pizza, it's going to be like, you can eat it like twice a week. I'm very excited. So we have three great topics to talk about in the world of national security and news. Today, we're doing a U.S. heavy topic, given everything that's happened. Topic 1, I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience. Classic Ronald Reagan zinger against Walter Mondale in the 1984 election. But unlike Ronald Reagan, Joe Biden's underwhelming performance at the first and perhaps only presidential debate has put his party into a panic about his chances to win the presidential election. Was Biden's performance as bad as the pundits and betting markets seem to think? And if so, what should he do about it? Both with respect to his staying in the race and even his ability to finish out his presidential term. Topic 2. When you're the president, they let you do it. After promising an opinion, quote, for the ages, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 party line decision held that presidents enjoy at least some degree of absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. Did the opinion, as the dissenting justices argued, make the president above the law? And what does the opinion mean for the ongoing criminal prosecutions seeking to hold Trump accountable for crimes he allegedly committed while in office? Topic 3. Tell it to my face. Shill challenge. We really need Scott back. I'm not good at this. The Supreme Court continues this pattern of not squarely addressing difficult legal issues about the internet. In Net Choice v. Moody, the court sent back 2 challenges to state social media moderation laws to the lower courts, instructing them to examine the laws on an as-applied rather than facial basis. What guidance did the court give to the lower courts on remand, and what questions about the scope of the platform's First Amendment protections remain unanswered? For topic 1, let me turn it to me to talk about the debate. So I did not watch the debate because I do not watch presidential debates because I just find the whole exercise just immensely painful. I do enjoy watching the live Twitter meta commentary about the debate as it goes on, and then of course tuning into the appropriate clips. And I have to say, it was not a great debate for Joe Biden. Especially the first half hour, he seemed out of it, tired, confused. He said all sorts of funny, mangled phrases. Although I do think that the second half of the debate was much better for him. Unfortunately, debates do tend to be won or lost in the first 15 or 20 minutes. I think a lot of viewers probably started that debate, saw what was going on, tuned off in despair. And the reaction has just been absolutely volcanic. You've had so many people come out of the woodwork. I mean, the entire, as far as I can tell, every single person that has ever written an editorial for the New York Times wrote an editorial the next day, basically saying that not only had Biden lost the race, but that he could in no way beat Trump and that he should drop out. Over the last few days, there's been a increasing chorus for Biden to drop out, largely outside the Democratic Party. But now you have a couple of lawmakers on the record calling for Biden to drop out. You have a lot of chatter. There's a lot of internal reporting about how the campaign is in confusion. The donors are freaking out. A lot of people in the Democratic Party are panicking. And as we record today, and we're recording in the early afternoon of July 3rd on Wednesday, there's a New York Times story suggesting that in a call to I think one of his donors, Biden, has admitted that he did very poorly and he's quote unquote considering his options. Though I just read a tweet that he was on a campaign call and he said he's in it for the end. But of course, that's what you kind of have to say, because the moment you say anything publicly that is not that, then you've basically dropped out of the debate. It is a real mess. And I should also say that early polling coming out suggests that Biden has lost several percentage points against Trump, who's already trailing him. The prediction markets, to the extent that you find those things useful, which I tend to, have massively downgraded Biden's chances. This is a real debacle. So, Kevin, how much of this painful debate did you watch? And do you think that the collective freakout that is currently happening is warranted?
So, like you, I did not watch live. It's past my bedtime, sadly. So I'm probably right up there in terms of, I'm surprised either of them were awake, given the start, I think, was 9 p.m. Eastern, which, don't get me started, that's a whole nother conversation. I think here the thing to keep in mind is that in politics, perception is reality. So there's been a lot of post-debate chat about, oh, well, if you look at Trump's performance, if you look at Biden's performance and you put them on paper or whatever, one lied more than the other or one misled more than the other, blah, 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 blah. What matters is the perception, and we're seeing that perception come about in the polls, as you mentioned, Alan, and that should send shockwaves through the Democratic Party. I think that there is a need to be realistic about what are your aims in this election. If it's to win, well, right now,
what else could it possibly be? Elections are pretty binary. It's like if you're not trying to win, what are you doing exactly?
That was my understanding. I'm not sure what's going on here, because this is the time, especially if you're framing this election as democracy or not democracy, to speak in some more binaries. Well, if the stakes are that high and you're seeing something trend in a very real and very negative direction, I think you need to respond in a way that suggests you do want to win. And there is still time to make a change. Would it be arguably unprecedented? Sure. Would it be really difficult and probably pretty messy? Also, yes. But if you want to win, you have to take drastic action. I would love to hear some more thoughts, though, on the extent to which we should take this polling seriously, because I do think that's an area that I'm always a little wishy-washy on is we've trusted Nate Silver on some things and we haven't on others. And like most polls, he's right when he wants to be right.
I think the problem here is that we're just trying to make big decisions based on a very small amount of data. And the thing about polling is that my best understanding from people who are in the industry is that it simply doesn't give you a quick and reliable answer to questions like these. There is the sort of moment in 2012 that I think a lot of listeners may remember where Obama did very poorly in his first debate against Romney and immediately plunged, I think like 5 points in the polls. It was a really steep decline. And there's a political science paper that I think is basically canon now that essentially shows that that was all from sort of disaffected Democrats not picking up the phone when pollsters called. And of course, as we all know, Obama went on to win that election. So I think that it is simply very difficult to know whether the polling shows actual move away from Biden, whether it's non-response by disappointed Democrats, whether it's increased response by excited Republicans, in the same way that after Trump's conviction in New York, it was very hard to know how to read those polls that we got that seemed to show a bit of a dip in support for Trump. And also, these things tend to take a few weeks to iron out. So there's something that's very commonly known in polling as the convention bump, where, right after the DNC or the RNC, the candidate in question will get a bump that tends to disappear in a couple weeks. So the debate was less than a week ago. We simply don't know yet. And I think that there is a level of desire for a clear right answer in looking at these polls that simply doesn't and won't and can't exist, which is frustrating, but that is what it is, really. I mean, I think the annoying fact right now is that we're sort of waiting for the movers and shakers in the Democratic Party to decide which way is up based on relatively little information that's available to the public. I will say, certainly there's indications that there are things that are concerning. It's also true, I think, that the press has really not covered itself in glory. There was sort of a rush of opinion columnists to write things like, "I told you so," and demand, frankly, absurd and bizarre solutions to this problem, such as passing over Vice President Harris as the nominee. Let me just say, if you're leading a coalition that depends heavily on female voters and on Black voters and on Black female voters to put together a winning coalition, passing over the first Black female vice president is not a winning move. That's not going to get you anywhere. And so I think that basically there's a lot we don't know, and that the people who are commenting on this need to take a deep breath and focus on the things that we do know, which is, there is just a lot of uncertainty here. And for all the people who are proposing, what if Michelle Obama ran, right? What if Sherrod Brown ran? Take a deep breath and think about what the mechanics of that actually are. No Democrat who is running for a Senate seat in a key seat for the Democrats this season is going to give that up to make a long shot run for the presidency. It simply does not make sense. Likewise, your options for campaign finance reasons, among with other sort of coalitional politics reasons, are Biden or Harris. Those are the options. If you want Biden to resign, then you have to deal with the question of what you're going to do about the vice presidency, because the House will not confirm a vice president. Then we're going to have the vice presidency empty. Do you want Mike Johnson to be the vice president while Harris is the president? Maybe you do. But what I'm saying is that there are concrete procedures here that we can look to that give answers to these questions. And I think a lot of the hyperventilating would be better replaced by some more focus on these concrete things.
So I did watch the debate all the way through and want to say,
wow, you have a strong stomach.
It's ready for clam pizza.
Sometimes you need to watch the train crash in order to realize that it is actually crashing. And I think that the debate really was over within the first 10 minutes. And I say that as someone who my friends can attest. I went into that night saying, He can pull off what he needs to. He doesn't need to be overly inspirational. He doesn't need to give us a King's Speech moment. He just needs to perform tonight. And so I went in with low expectations, and not to get more meta about what the presidency means and stuff, but this is, I think, for a lot of young people, not just about an age game, right? Because obviously there's a little bit of parity there between Trump and Biden. And maybe it's not even about just how to counter Trump. Is Biden a visionary president? Does he have the ability to articulate policies that can move the nation in a very difficult moment, by the way? I think we're losing a lot of the overlaying. We're still voting for a president, a person for whom governing is his job. And if someone can't go onto a debate stage and let alone finish a sentence, but articulate some sort of vision for the country, then maybe he really just doesn't deserve to be the nominee. I think that we're focusing on the strategy elements of things because Dems desperately want to win this election, and we have to win this election. But because of that, we're missing just I think a pretty basic question, which is Joe Biden prepared to be president in general? And I think that on the debate stage, he unfortunately let a lot of people down. And I think that the next step in that moment for a real leader, someone who spent his whole life as a public servant, is maybe then thinking, okay, this is no longer my time, and giving it to, I agree, I think Kamala Harris would be the right choice here, and ushering her into the role and allowing her to become the president that we need in this very moment. So I'm still very much I can believe in good governance and I'm optimistic type of person. And so I would really like to see the narrative kind of shift towards, oh, well, not just we need to do this to counter Trump or we need to let Biden go because he's too old, but maybe him thinking about this in a more visionary, expansive way of how can I pass the torch down to the next person, and then by doing so also just like win the election. I think that you can achieve both.
So are you, when you say pass the torch, are you a he should, I mean, putting Quinta's very fair point about what you do about the VP slot, though I think going without a VP for 5 months is not the end of the world, even if some catastrophe happens and Mike Johnson becomes president. I mean, there's an election and none of this matters that much, right? We're gonna have an election either way, and so we're gonna have a new administration in January. But putting aside the empty VP slot, or are you a team Biden gets out of the race and kind of anoints Kamala Harris, or Biden resigns and President Harris gets to run for re-election, quote unquote?
I think that he can carry out the rest of his term. I mean, not to be too cynical about how the presidency works, but I mean, I think we know that there are safeguards, right? The cabinet, other parts of the executive branch and the federal government is well functioning for a reason. I think for good reason. There is not, if Biden has good days and bad days, that's, I think, insulated by design. And I think that that's okay. And I feel comfortable just saying, okay, Biden, even though he might not be able to do another whole 4 years, I don't think we should like try and kick him out now just to prepare like a re-election of a Kamala Harris. But I do think that he should drop out of the race, right? And start to say, look, I'm prepared to do what I need to do. Here's what I have. Here's what I want to do for the rest of this term, and cooperate with Kamala, and like they should align their strategy and priorities and say, this is what you'll see in the next 4 years if you continue to vote for the Democrats, and kind of create that kind of coalition. But I don't necessarily think he needs to leave right now. And I think that the problem of having an empty VP seat that Quinta raises is serious.
I really like this good governance angle, and I think it's being undercovered. Obviously, we're still in the throes of this, so that's somewhat unsurprising. But the fact that we're seeing more and more anonymous sources come out of the woodwork right now and say that this wasn't the first indication of Biden having more physical and mental struggles is profoundly disappointing, especially from a White House that was emphasizing its desire to be more transparent in comparison to the prior administration. To not be fully open about the president's struggles in the lead up to what has been deemed by many in that very White House as the most consequential election perhaps in generations is, again, profoundly disappointing. And I think that some of the responses not to be too flippant, but have reminded me a lot of an SNL skit that came out a couple months ago where they were doing a bunch of interviews with White House staffers, and they were like, yeah, Joe just led a Peloton class. He crushed it. And then, oh, Joe this morning, he had 5 Celsius, right? Like, he's ready to go. He's going to issue all of the policy statements. And it's like, cool. I'm glad he works out. I'm glad he can walk. But to Haven's point, the fact that he still needs an afternoon nap, like, I get that napping is important.
I mean, I need an afternoon nap.
Exactly.
Though I am also not running for president, to be clear, for many reasons.
That is my profound point. As I told my wife, I take a nice nap in between my civil procedure sections because there's no way I'm going to go lecture. But if I were president, you bet I would be cramming like 5 Celsius to make it to that next meeting. I'm not saying during those 4 years, you have to be on point. You don't get that afternoon nap. That is a luxury and not a right, especially if you're president. I'm sorry to the right to nap folks in France who are actively pushing that.
I also think that any Democrat who still thinks that the RBG not retiring was a mistake, which, I mean, definitely see their point, is almost required to see it in a similar light here with Biden. Obviously, there are disanalogies here, but open up the space for someone who can more comfortably win and can perform at the job in a critical moment, and don't lose this opportunity because we want to. I mean, what's the real reason why we should keep him in office right now? Does anyone have an affirmative?
Well, reason? I think that there is a lot that's not clear, right? I will say I've been look, after Robert Hur's report came out, indicating that the president might have some memory problems, I was keeping a close eye on the news reports over the next couple weeks on the grounds that sort of provided an opportunity for anyone who was concerned about Biden's mental state to leak it to a reporter, and that there would be, if there was a problem, there would be a lot of big stories. There were not. And then I kind of looked at that and said, okay, maybe we're good. Same after the State of the Union. I'm not saying that there is not potentially a problem here, but I will say that I have been very struck by the amount of stories saying, people are concerned about Biden. And the substance is kind of not there, or something that you could read either way. I'm not saying that there's nothing, but there are examples that it was not clear to me that the situation is bad. So personally, I would say if you're arguing for, just as a governance matter, if you're arguing that the president needs to step down, I just don't think that we've seen evidence of that in the press right now. The stories have been, much, much milder. The New York Times reporting on this is sort of padded out by weird things like noting that instance when he was in France, when he wandered off to talk to a paratrooper. That kind of thing is something that Joe Biden has done his entire career. Or appearing not to be able to say Alejandro Mayorkas's name. If you watch the video, it is very clear that he has a stutter, and he is talking around the stutter. I don't know what's going on. I'm not riding for Biden or whatever. But I do think that it is worth acknowledging that the situation is a lot more uncertain than I think a lot of the commentary seems to allow. I think it is also worth saying, by the way, that yes, I definitely think that the president should be, of sound mental state and able to leap into action and so on and so forth. But a lot of the conversation around this has been gleefully cruel toward people who are aging or have other disabilities in a way that I find unbelievably off-putting. If you have known someone or love someone who suffers from dementia, that is an awful, awful condition. And I am really, frankly, grossed out by all of the people who are making fun of he should be drooling in front of the television. Biden signed legislation earlier today, establishing a big bucket of funding for research into Parkinson's. And Brian Stelter, formerly of CNN, made a crack about, of all the times to sign legislation about Parkinson's. That's a real disease. This is a serious conversation. You don't have to take cheap shots.
I completely agree with you. I And I want to
Not saying that you took cheap shots, to be clear.
Yeah, I want to be clear that when I'm talking about sound of mind, I'm definitely not endorsing the rhetoric by which some people have described Biden, but and maybe I want to divorce Biden from this and just go again a little bit more academically on this question. I think my point is, I don't know why we're trying so hard to make excuses for someone who just may not be able to do the job anymore in a way that in a way that obscures what we should be expecting of the president. And I think that's my problem with the Biden discourse right now. I think a lot of it, again, tolerance for gerontocracy is, I think, it's perhaps normalized in a way these past couple of years because all of our candidates are of that age anyway. And so it's like we're trying to decide between people in the same age group. But on the other hand, we're just forgetting that it does not need to be that way in theory, right? We have a viable candidate that we could be running instead. And I think he just needs to be held to the same standards as if he weren't the incumbent and he were just a person that we are trying to decide, is this person a president and can this person perform as president? And those aren't the questions that are being asked, at least the ones that I'm hearing.
Moving things along to another nationwide debate, the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision granted former President Donald Trump partial immunity from the ongoing election subversion case brought by special counsel Jack Smith. The majority decision identified varying degrees of immunity based on the nature of the presidential action in question. Chief Justice Roberts asserted that, quote, Congress may not criminalize the president's conduct in carrying out the responsibilities of the executive branch under the Constitution, end quote. These sorts of core presidential actions received absolute immunity from the majority. Other official actions involving more routine powers should receive some protection, the court said. How much, though, has been kicked down to lower courts to determine. The dissenting justices penned 2 separate dissents. Justice Sotomayor's dissent has received particular attention. She interpreted the majority as holding that in every use of official power, the president is now, quote, a king above the law, end quote. Well, there are no shortage of hot takes out there, and I'm keen to get some reactions to a few of them. So one, to start with, was from Professor Judd Sugarman, and he expressed surprise about the absence of originalism in the majority opinion. And as reported by CNN, Michael Rappaport, who runs the Center for the Study of Constitutional Originalism at the University of San Diego School of Law, asserted, quote, presidential immunity does not accord with the original meaning of the Constitution, end quote. So just to stop there, what are our thoughts about whether this marks the sort of end of originalism? Was this a departure from originalism? Did we expect more from the majority with respect to a historical deep dive? What's the gut reaction there?
Yeah, so on the originalism point, I mean, look, I never thought that originalism was the dominant methodology on the court. I mean, it uses originalism when it wants to, and it doesn't when it doesn't. Also, John Roberts is not an originalist. I mean, he uses it sometimes, but he's not particularly committed to it. And you know, the last thing I'll say about that, right, is just that originalism is always just one of many methodologies that courts use. The methodology that's used here is some combination of precedent. I mean, trying to take, Nixon versus Fitzgerald, which is the civil immunity case, and try to apply it to the criminal context. But most importantly, it's just a kind of structural policy balancing where the Chief Justice in particular is trying to do some incentive analysis and, figure out a appropriate workable rule, which for the record is the methodology that I think probably courts should use in separation of powers cases, whether or not you agree that they got it right here. I definitely don't think it's the end of originalism. I mean, I guarantee you there's going to be some case next year where the court's going to go full originalist, and maybe there will be some grumpy snipe from the dissent saying, oh, now you're originalist? What about when we were original? What about last term? And then they'll just ignore it because that's never been the role of originalism. I mean, maybe if it was a court of 9 Justice Thomases, it would be. But of course, even if it was a court of 9 Justice Thomases, there are lots of different ways that you can slice the founding evidence. Right now there's a debate going on among law professors about, did Sotomayor's citation of some part of James Wilson in fact support her analysis of what the founders wanted? And I don't know, right? But again, I think it matters also a lot less, in large part because the presidency has also evolved massively from what it was in 1789 when the Constitution was ratified. I mean, the Constitution always contemplated a reasonably powerful executive. Depends on what you mean by reasonably powerful, but certainly the Constitution in large part was or at least Article 2 of the Constitution is in some large part a reaction to the Articles of Confederation and their lack of a clearly strong executive. So definitely there's kind of a thumb on the scale for an executive of, unity and dispatch and all the things that Hamilton talks about in Federalist 70. But, over the last 250 years, the presidency has also increased massively in power. We talk about the imperial presidency, really the presidency that was born out of World War II and the Cold War national security state. And so then the question, of course, is, given that the presidency is different now, how do you apply the constitutional baseline? And which direction do you apply it? Because you could imagine applying it in different ways. You could say, well, it is the fact that the president is more powerful means that immunity is even less appropriate than it was at the founding because you need that check. Or you could argue the president is more powerful, he or she has more responsibilities, therefore immunity is even more important because more rests in the president's discretion. And so those concerns about chilling the vigor, right, the vigor and dispatch of the presidency is even higher. So, this is the problem with originalism. It is just radically undeterminate on all the interesting questions.
I think it's worth taking a step back also and just saying, when we heard oral arguments in this case, I don't think that anyone thought that the court would be establishing an immunity this expensive. At least every single person that I spoke to, and my own impression was that we were all pretty sure that the court might establish some, limited core of absolute immunity for sort of core presidential conduct. But beyond that, it was simply obvious that Trump would not be immune for the conduct as described in the indictment, and that was the end of it. And that there was some irritation, at least speaking for myself, at the fact that the court had decided to take up this case when it was so transparently obvious that it was basically going to make some, relatively minor revisions around the edges of the DC Circuit opinion. The ruling that the court produced is so far from that I do not know a single person who anticipated this. I have not spoken to a single person who was expecting anything like this. I try to keep things on a pretty even keel, but I will say I am so completely shocked by this decision that I feel like I have to recalibrate my entire understanding of the Supreme Court, except that I don't even know what to calibrate it around because it just turns everything upside down and backwards. And what I mean by that is that if you had spoken to me last week, what I would have told you was, well, it's an extremely conservative court. There's sort of a hardcore MAGA block in Alito and Thomas. Then you have the libs. And then there's this kind of, floating four. Gorsuch is maybe more conservative. Barrett, Kavanaugh, Roberts are sort of, definitely part of the conservative legal movements, but more institutionalist, tend to not be aligned with Trump individually. Are often pushed back against him in instances where their interests do not align with his, and that was sort of the story. And I frankly don't think that is true anymore, and I don't know why it isn't, but it clearly isn't, because the extent to which the court went into this ruling with its head kind of gleefully buried in the sand about what we are potentially headed toward is genuinely shocking to me. I am extremely worried about what this would portend for a second Trump presidency. And the court seems not to be concerned at all. And so to that extent, we are simply living on different planet Earths. I think it says a lot that the people who called this right are the people who are not experts and whose metric for understanding the court is basically, oh, well, they're all Republican hacks. Though it physically pains me to say it, they got this one and I did not. And I think that merits some deep self-reflection. I will also say, and I would love to know if I'm wrong here, I have not seen a single respectable member of the conservative legal Academy, commentariat, what have you, affirmatively defending this opinion. I have seen a lot of mockery of people criticizing it. I have not seen anyone go out there and say, this is a good opinion. The best that I have seen is people saying, well, it's understandable because this is hard. But there is nobody who has been out there affirmatively endorsing it. And I frankly think that speaks volumes.
Would you say that Jack Goldsmith falls into the, well, this was hard, what did you expect?
Jack's is the strongest endorsement that I have seen, and he does not endorse it.
So Quinta, I'm curious what part of the opinion, I want to zoom in more and get your sense of what part of the opinion you found particularly extreme, right? Because to me, actually, once you have established that there's a core zone of absolute immunity, right? That to me is actually the most extreme part of the opinion. And everything they say other than that strikes me as actually it's much harder to know what exactly they mean. And so is it or is it not extreme? So I understand the opinion as sort of fundamentally having three parts to it, or three main holdings, right? So one is there's this preclusive core of stuff that the president is just absolutely immune from. It is basically kind of what wouldn't otherwise be in Youngstown Category 3. Then there's this everything else that's official. He gets presumptive but not absolute immunity, and then you apply, and I think it's the Franklin. I forget what
Franklin v. Massachusetts.
Yeah, Franklin v. Massachusetts, right? Which is a statutory interpretation case, but here the court says uses it and says, you get presumptive immunity unless the government can show that the prosecution will not interfere with the president's powers, and you get this last kind of drive-by bit about what you can and cannot bring into evidence, which is a big deal, though there's this footnote where Robert says, but obviously public records of the conduct can be admissible, and it's kind of hard to know exactly how big of a loophole that is. So what to you, because you seemed, I don't know, put words in your mouth, but as you were describing your reaction to the opinion, you did not seem super scandalized by that first part, right? The existence of absolute immunity for the core preclusive parts. So what part surprised you the most? The evidentiary part or the presumptive, but not necessarily, and we don't know how far that is? Because if it turns out that that's not very broad, then maybe this wasn't quite as radical of an opinion as I think a lot of people are reading it. And I'll put my cards on the table. I view this opinion as less radical. Maybe farther. I don't think the evidentiary stuff was necessary, but potentially, especially if the presumptive but not absolute part ends up being interpreted kind of narrowly, then I don't know, this thing's not that big of a deal. But tell me why I'm wrong. You've read this opinion much more carefully than I have.
So a few different things. I think that I certainly agree, and Lee Kowarski had a really good op-ed in the New York Times about this while we were waiting for the decision to come out, that it is not unreasonable to say that there is some core of immunity. Core, right?
Though I will say that is not what the DC Circuit said. And
that is true.
I will say there's a little bit of, not from you, but there's a little bit of retconning of everyone saw this part of the opinion coming, where it's actually there's a lot of people that the DC Circuit should just be clearly affirmed, and some other people saying, no, the court has to clarify this. And so I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, what I'm saying is if the Supreme Court had ruled that, I would not have been shocked or upset. That's what I'm trying to say. I think there are a bunch of different things that are going on here. One is that the division between, okay, so let's do category 1, category 2, category 3, Youngstown style. Category 1, core absolute immunity. Category 2, presumptive immunity, which may in fact be absolute immunity. I think a lot of people are missing this. The majority says explicitly it's presumptive, but maybe it's absolute. Who knows? Tee-hee, we don't have to decide here. That goes out to the outer perimeter of the president's responsibilities. Then we have category 3, unofficial acts, no immunity. I think there are multiple problems here. The first problem is that the border between the categories is very murky. I do not know what is in category 1 and category 2. I cannot distinguish them for you. The reasons are complicated. We had a long back and forth in Slack about this. I don't know what, SEAL Team 6 hypo, president orders assassination of a political rival. Is that category 1 or category 2? I don't know. Now, let's say that it's category 2. If it's in category 2, how do you rebut the presumption? Which again, it may not be presumption. It may just be absolute. How do you rebut that presumption? Robert says, oh, well, Franklin v. Massachusetts, it's okay if you're not having, if there's no reason to think it would interfere with the lawful exercise of presidential power or something.
Yeah, no danger or no risk.
Right.
That's the
I don't know how to interpret that standard because the Roberts interprets the category of presidential power so expansively that there is all kinds of stuff in there that he's pointing to in the indictment that I absolutely would have said that is unofficial conduct that he thinks is potentially official and within the outer perimeter. And so the problem is he's drawn, including calling up the chairwoman of the RNC to get the fake electors plot started because, the president has the authority to ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. So he was just helping administer the election. And so the problem is that Roberts is drawing a hugely expansive boundary here. He is not defining where the boundary lines are. And then if you're in the middle category of presumptive, it is not clear how to rebut that presumption. And then on top of that, you cannot use any evidence of official acts, which again, we don't know what they are. You cannot use any evidence of official acts to prosecute the president at all. So, okay, let's do our SEAL Team 6 hypo again, right? If the president gives the order to SEAL Team 6, assassinate my political rival, that order is an official act. You can't use it in evidence.
Well, you can use public.
You can use public. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's say,
I'll admit I'm not entirely sure what that means.
The president says at the State of the Union, with this line, I am ordering SEAL Team 6 to assassinate my political rivals. State of the Union, that's a core presidential power. Commander-in-Chief clause, core presidential power. Then there was a report in the news the next day about that. Can you use that news report?
I think so. I mean, isn't that what public means?
No, but we do not know. And so this is my point, is that the point of having a criminal law.
Just a reminder, I did not write this opinion.
No, but look, the point of having criminal law is deterrence. I do not see, looking at this opinion, how you are supposed to look at this and say that this deters anything. Because the scope of potentially shielded conduct is so vast, it is so unclear how to pierce it, and the limitations on what you can point to as evidence. By the way, we also can't include motive. So if the president says, calls up the New York Times and says, I hate my rival and I want him dead, this isn't a national security matter. Can't introduce that. So it just it is so expansive in what it protects, and it provides for so many rounds of interlocutory appeal before any of this gets to a court that it strikes me as fundamentally creating a shield that will never be pierced. And I think that's disturbing.
To what extent, though, is this a reflection of the fact that we tend to write laws and interpret the Constitution assuming good faith applications of those powers? And
yes, one might even say virtuous executives in the White House.
One might say. So the idea that this opinion could stretch to every edge case in and of itself, it was, of course, never going to do this. And I do think it is fascinating to think about the comparison to Youngstown Steel, where if you go and reread that concurrence and see just how murky the boundaries were there, now every con law professor teaches that as wow, look at this great opinion, creating some space for the branches to interact with one another. So I do think that there were just limits that we have to respect to drafting any opinion to be able to say with specificity, we have to draw a line here, we have to draw a line there. So unfortunately, as Heyman's going to know well sooner rather than later, it depends really does seem to me like a pretty good response here of we just don't know enough yet whether this opinion is going to open some sort of floodgates to the worst executive ever, or if really it's just going to ensure that we do have some core powers that are protected for the president to be as energetic as Hamilton and good old Federalist number 70 anticipated and desired.
It's fair to say, I take the point that we won't know for sure, but I really take Quinta's deterrence point seriously, and I think that the liberal dissents really did hone in on that lack of safeguard now. And I mean, Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent was really, her dissent was very academic. It was let's step back and see how this creates a paradigm shift between basic understandings of criminal law in society and how this creates a new presidential exception and gives the courts more power in the process, right? She thinks that one of the big problems here is that now even something that is facially obviously a crime now has to go through layers and layers of court adjudication in a way that becomes nonsensical, and there's no really grounds for that in the Constitution or in precedent or in historical practice. So why are we creating a separate exception for a president in a way that actually puts more power into the hands of the judiciary? She thinks that that's kind of what's happening here in the shift of powers. Do you think that that's right? That that's actually what's happening? Because I think that that is pretty true.
I think what's notable here is, and I'm riffing here on a point that our executive editor, Natalie Orpett, made to me, that the court is positioning itself as the defender of the executive branch here, but the executive branch didn't want or ask from this. We know what the executive branch thinks. This is Trump v. United States. United States is on the other side. Like, we know that DOJ was fine with this prosecution because they're bringing it. So there's this weirdness where the court is saying, like, you need this to allow the president to president, when presumably OLC doesn't even think that it's necessary.
So getting back away from theory land, which is always fun, and getting into the scary world of the real world, what are the practical results of this opinion in the ongoing case? So we've seen conversation about the evidence that may be impacted here as a result of the opinion, but what are the concerns about the potential delay resulting from this opinion?
Well, I mean, there's no way that this is being tried before the election. I mean, Judge Chutkan, who's running the case, she has to go line by line through the opinion, or through the indictment, and parse out, what of the indicted acts are official and what are not. The unofficial ones can continue. But of the official ones, then she has to say, okay, are these like core preclusive powers? I mean, the court already told her that some of them are. For example, Trump talking to Jeff Clark, who was briefly the acting attorney general. But you can imagine there are other official acts that are core and therefore absolutely immune. And then for all the ones that are not core, and presumably talking to Pence would be one of those, reaching out to Republican, chair people across the country, those might be official acts. Various speeches might be official acts. Then Chutkan has to say, okay, well, is this this is presumptively immune, but is it absolutely immune? And through all of this, she's presumably going to have to hear from the parties. And then every single one of those decisions is then subject to interlocutory appeal. So, I mean, this is going to last for years, actually. I mean, assuming Trump does not win. If Trump wins, this thing goes away because he will direct Attorney General Giuliani. The Attorney General has to be learned in the law, but doesn't have to be barred.
Actually, interesting question about whether the court's ban on using evidence that's drawn from official acts is sufficiently broad that Giuliani could petition to have his disbarment reheard.
Oh my God. Awesome. Because if Trump is elected, he will make this case go away one way or the other. So this is not going to trial for years, if ever.
There is a silver lining, though, which Norm Eisen and Joshua Kolb wrote for Lawfare about, which is this idea of like a mini trial that could happen as Chutkan has to go through and adjudicate each and every, is this official and covered or not official and covered? And even if that doesn't, of course, result in the jury trial that we want to see happen before the election, it still would put in front of the public a lot of evidence about what he did or did not do, and they will have to uncover a lot of details in that process. So I do think that that's possibly one way that we can see something happen, even though the trial itself definitely won't.
So there was something else that happened at the court on Monday. The decision that everyone truly was waiting for. Dun, 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 dun.
It's the one I was waiting for.
Net choice.
I'll be honest. That's the one I cared about.
So I will confess that in the midst of immunity fever, I have not actually had time to give net choice a particularly close read, but my perception is that the court has once again kicked the can down the road, but maybe not as far as we originally thought. Kevin, is that fair?
I think it's fair. It's kind of like a Lucy punt where she pulls it away at the last second, and so
Totally
they
a
kick
Lucy,
it.
totally a Lucy punt.
They get it a little down the road, but really, I do think that this wasn't the right time to challenge these laws, right? This just came down to, should this be a facial challenge or an as-applied challenge? And the fact of the matter is that both the Texas law and the Florida law contained a lot of ambiguities that were never going to be resolved on a facial challenge. And so the points raised by the justices in their very complicated, consolidated opinion with multiple concurrences going off in fascinating directions was that they didn't have enough to be able to assess, using the appropriate test, whether the constitutional provisions more or less outweighed the unconstitutional provisions. And to make that assessment, we needed to know whether Etsy was going to be impacted, Gmail was going to be impacted. Apparently,
BeReal.
Justice Alito has a BeReal. Was BeReal going to be impacted? There were just way too many questions. And so that's why there's a sense of disappointment here, is that we didn't get the answers we were hoping for. But in retrospect, and this is another opinion I think where legal scholars maybe got caught on their bums a little bit, this was really foreseeable, that this wasn't going to be answerable as a facial challenge to these laws. But I'm keen to hear what my esteemed colleagues have to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all correct, and I mean, I really want to write a lawfare piece about that. The Supreme Court appears to be scared of the internet because first you have this Gonzalez decision about Section 230 that they massively punt. I mean, they totally punt on that one. Then there's this NetChoice decision, which again, they don't entirely punt on it, but they definitely leave a huge amount on the table. Then there was just another cert denial in a Section 230 case because they're too scared about that. I will say the court is taking the Texas pornography age verification case next term, so hopefully they'll answer that, and we'll see if they take the TikTok case as well. But they have like a healthy fear of the internet, which I think is probably a good thing.
I think that this is woefully understudied, but thankfully, in shameless self-promotion, I've written on this, saying that judges get
always be closing, Kevin.
They always be closing, cobbling, and citing your own work. So judges do really get an F in judicial education. There should not be an expectation that the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are internet experts. Justice Kagan has said as much. And no one really takes them seriously when they say, we don't understand these issues. And that's a profound thing that we should pay more attention to, is that having things like, as Justice Barrett raised in her concurrence, soon they may be grappling with, to what extent is AI moderated content, or using AI to moderate content, in expressive activity? Well, you can be sure that they're going to have to answer questions about LLMs, about neural networks, about the black box of AI that is difficult for even the most learned AI experts to dive into. So should we expect a really nuanced opinion from the Supreme Court on AI? No. Right? I don't think so. And so that's something that legal scholars and the judiciary really has to grapple with, is what do we do with questions that are clearly beyond the technical capacity of the court? But now we're going down a fun rabbit hole that I could just talk about for like 5 hours, 6 hours. And I already had my athletic beer, so, I'm pretty much just on that NA train. So I may have to go get another 6-pack of that.
I mean, just get back to the opinion for a second. I mean, I think the real question, and I need to reread this opinion. I mean, I read it. I've read it reasonably carefully, but I need to really parse it extremely carefully, because what I'm trying to figure out is just how much has actually been decided. So, technically everything other than the part about the facial and as applied is dicta. And, Jackson calls that out as much in her concurrence, where she actually pointedly declines to sign on to some of Kagan's merits dicta, for lack of a better term, because it's dicta. But it's pretty clear that there are at least 5 votes for, I think, the proposition that social media content moderation decisions are, at least in their core application, expressive speech under the First Amendment. So, for example, if some member of the some human being on the Facebook content moderation team goes and takes down some piece of content because they think that piece of content is hateful and in violation of Facebook's anti-hate speech policies, that decision is core editorial First Amendment protected in exactly the same way that, going all the way back to the Tornillo case, which is the kind of, ur text of this line of doctrine. Going back to the Tornillo case, declining to publish an editorial because you don't like it is core First Amendment protected speech. Okay, fair enough. And that does actually kick out a lot of at least the Texas law, because the Texas law was all about you have to be neutral in how you moderate certain types of content. And neutrality implies that you can't take a position saying this is not a neutral issue, right? There's anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism. Like, they're not two sides, like two equally good sides of the coin, right? Or, racism and anti-racism, or things like that. Fine, fair enough. The question is, how much does that still leave on the table? So there's all the stuff that Kevin just mentioned about AI, algorithmic content moderation, content moderation that's purely based on goosing engagement. Like, does that really express you? I don't know the answer. I don't think the court does either. I think if Kagan had her way, I think almost all of this would be unconstitutional, but I'm not sure Kagan has the votes for that. But I'm not even sure that some of the stuff in the Florida law is necessarily unconstitutional. So the Florida law, which I think is more interesting than the Texas law, says if you're a certain kind of person, right? If you're a journalist, for example, you can't be censored because we think that journalistic speech has very high value. Or if you're a politician, you can't be censored because we think there's a really important public interest in people getting to be able to listen to what politicians say. Are we sure that that too is now unconstitutional under this opinion? I'm not entirely convinced that it is, actually. I mean, again, I have to go really parse the part of the Kagan opinion, but I just think that this, other than saying that, viewpoint-based interventions by the government are unconstitutional, fair enough. That's not nothing. That's not a nothing statement. I actually think that a ton is still left on the table, which is, I think, where a lot of the, oh my God, I can't believe they did this again, which was my initial reaction when I first saw the opinion, although I walked it back a little bit. I think that's where a lot of the, oh my God, I can't believe they punted again came from.
I think another really interesting angle here, in addition to trying to draw a line about what is expressive and what is not, is what is a valid state interest here. So, Alan, you were hinting at this on what if states did have an interest in making sure you had access to journalists, for example, and that you got their unfettered opinion? The Kagan opinion was fairly dismissive of this idea that states might want to have a hand in the information ecosystem that is available to their residents. And in many cases, I think we've seen that states do have, whether it's a public health interest, whether it is a educational interest, you name it, we can play hypothetical all day. I don't think it's an open and shut case that a state doesn't have some sort of legitimate interest in shaping the information ecosystem. Now, to Alan's point, we know there's a red line on viewpoint discrimination, sure. But can we have a B12 injection, right, of certain viewpoints or of certain information to make sure that some broad general welfare goal is realized by the state? And for me, that's going to be one of the most fascinating questions to get debated and sorted out when we eventually see some applied challenge.
Yeah, I just want to say, it really makes my heart sink every time I see Buckley versus Vallejo's, I think, pretty infamous line about how there's just no conceivably legitimate state interest in trying to balance the information sphere when that's cited. And like, by Kagan of all people, I mean, this is, and look, like, so the irony right here is, and I am stealing this from the moderated content podcast, but with Evelyn Dueck and Genevieve Lake here, who released a podcast on this earlier this week. Kagan, of course, was the Solicitor General who argued Citizens United and lost so very badly. Citizens United, which of course is just a very straightforward application of Buckley versus Vallejo, to corporations. Now, of course, she had a client, and that's fine. No one has to hold her to what she said as Solicitor General. And of course, maybe her thinking has evolved. And in her defense, her scholarship, her First Amendment scholarship as a law professor, when she was a law professor, was about being really skeptical of government motives when doing First Amendment analysis. But it's just so depressing to see, someone of the quote unquote liberal wing just accepting the whole Lochnerized First Amendment premise. And while I get that progressives don't like these laws and they really don't like the Texas and Florida legislatures, and that Net Choice really managed to get a lot of kind of liberal and left-wing support behind them, to have that line cited approvingly is just, it's a huge, I think, loss for the very same progressive interests that in any other context would be looking at these literally the biggest companies in the world, right, by a very large margin, and would in any other context want the government to have the ability to, forget even being actually able to regulate them, have the government interest in being able to regulate them recognized as legitimate, which is just the starting point of the analysis. And I just think that you're going to look back on this and really, really regret that line is in the opinion. My heart certainly sank when I read it.
Alan, when you go back and do your second deep read as a fellow con law professor, I think you really should spend some time on the Justice Thomas concurrence. The point about facial challenges and Article 3 being valid or not as cases or controversies, upon reflection, is a really interesting case that I think my students will have to struggle with when I assign it to them down the road as to whether or not we should be hearing facial challenges.
You really don't care about your course evaluations, do you, Kevin?
Oh, they love me for the bad puns,
Nice.
Or they hate me for them. But you got to go the good and the bad.
Well, that brings us to the end of our allotted time this week, but it would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons. So, Quinta, let's start with you and the no doubt cheerful, lighthearted, and frivolous object lesson that you have for us, because that's what we need, Quinta, this week. You should understand that more than anything.
So I have a television show.
Is it the 17-part version of Showa or something?
It's animated.
Okay, it's good. Maybe.
It's called Scavenger's Reign, and it is about a group of astronauts who are shipwrecked on an alien planet. And it is mostly vibes, but the animation is beautiful, and it seems pretty clear that the animators were like, we just want to draw a lot of weird alien creatures, and then kind of made up a plot to fit. But I am really, really enjoying it. It has vibes that kind of remind me of the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, for anyone who is into that. The movie Annihilation is based on the first book in that series. Just sort of like what it looks like to navigate a landscape that is in all senses alien to you. And I have been really enjoying it. It is not super cheerful. I will say that there is some animated gore. And I feel like I'm only midway through, but we are probably not headed to a happy ending. But it is some visually pretty astonishing escapism.
On the Jurassic meter, though, of object lessons, that's pretty far on the frivolous side. So I really appreciate that. Kevin, what do you have for us?
Yeah, so your must-watch assignment is Under Paris.
By the way, I clicked on the link in our planning doc. Okay, I'll just let you describe it. It is insane looking.
If you don't watch Under Paris this weekend, your life will be significantly worse. My wife and I love shark movies, and this one is going to be one for the ages. You will be telling your kids will be showing their grandkids. This is Netflix content that will not disappear. It crosses all the boxes off of a great shark movie because they never miss an opportunity. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but you will not be disappointed. If you like to open water swim like I do, highly recommend not watching this the day before you go for an open water swim. So the next day I'm swimming out in Biscayne Bay.
Yeah, are there sharks down in South Florida?
Well, so my wife's on a stand-up paddleboard and she starts waving her arms and I'm like, oh great, she saw another manatee. Cool, that's great. She goes, Kevin, stop. I'm like, what? a reef shark, like 6 feet long, went right in front of her. So then, of course, I Google, and there have been 24 reported reef shark attacks in the history of man, and I'm convinced I will be the 25th. Long way of saying it's still worth watching Under Paris. You're going to love it. Tell me your reviews. If you're disappointed, I don't know, rewatch it because you must have not been paying attention. So enjoy that.
Wow, every week is Shark Week in Paris. All right, Heyman, what's your object lesson other than future clam pizza?
My object lesson is a book that I just read. I know it's a little boring, but I thought it was really good to read in this moment. It's called The Geopolitics of Shaming by Rochelle Turman, which talks about why human rights pressure sometimes works and why it doesn't work. And I don't want to give too much of her thesis away because I think everyone should read it, but it really overlays interpersonal shaming sociology ideas onto the international system and the state system in a way that is pretty new and I think is just more honest about how norms really work. We think norms are these higher ideal things that we like. What are even norms? I guess that's like a starting question too that she's trying to parse out in this book, and it's a pretty refreshing take on how we actually enforce things in the international system. And it's a pretty short book, so I think it's doable, even though obviously it's written by political scientists, so it'll still be weedy. But yeah, I think that is my object lesson, especially in context of how it feels like norms are not being enforced in a lot of ways right now throughout our many wars that we're seeing. So I would recommend.
It sounds fascinating, but I will say I do hope you get to do something a little more frivolous than read something called The Geopolitics of Shaming the summer before law school. Though again, it sounds like a very interesting book.
No more shaming me for my weighty object lessons.
I will say, Heyman, you pulled a full Jurassic.
I'm sorry, I had to do what she would not do this week for good reasons. But I did go to Alaska, and I guess the small part 2 object lesson would be to think about the glaciers and how quickly they are.
Oh my God.
Okay, maybe
you're just double downing. This is a double Jurassic.
It started on a high.
No, okay, maybe just go to Alaska. That's my object lesson, I guess.
Excellent. And I guess I will finish us out. So I got tenure this year, which was very exciting. I'm also a father of 2 in my late 30s. So I got myself a tenure present, and because I am a father of 2 in my late 30s, it is a grill. I spent, as you can imagine, way too much time researching this, and I got myself a gravity charcoal grill, which is awesome. So basically, it's like a pellet grill, but using charcoal. So there's like a big, just regular grill chamber, and then to the side, there's a big chimney that you fill with charcoal, and you light it from the bottom, and there's a fan, and the fan is connected to a thermostat, which measures the temperature inside the grill. And so you can set it to anything between 150 degrees and 700 degrees. And the fan will kick on to keep the temperature in the grill to what you want it. And because the charcoal burns from the bottom up, as the charcoal in the combustion chamber burns, it drops into the ash hopper, and then more charcoal just gravity feeds down. It's amazing. Like, you get all the benefits of cooking with charcoal, but without any of like the fuss of having to dial in your kettle grill, which I have enjoyed for the last couple of years. But it's extremely nerdy. I've only done a couple of cooks on it, but the results have been very bueno, muy delicioso.
This is a Torts hypo waiting to happen. But I'm glad you're enjoying it now.
I think it's like pretty well made. There's like a pretty decent heat shield, but it is a little scary.
Keep this in mind for when you take Torts.
It gets scary when it gets going, but I will just say, like, really fun, really, really fun toy.
So you're hosting us for the 4th.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if anyone wants to come to Minnesota, I will cook up all sorts of good stuff. Well, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links and past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other podcast series, including The Aftermath. And be sure to follow us on X at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osmond of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. We are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patja. On behalf of my co-host Quinta and special guests Kevin Frazier and Heyman Han, I am Alan Rosenstein, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.